Alencia, how does President Biden court those anti-Trump Republicans without alienating his Democratic base?
Yeah, I think that's a very fine needle that he has to thread, because a lot of the base does not want the Democratic Party or President Biden to move further to moderate positions or further to the right. And, you know, the president is going to have to show voters on the tomorrow's debate that he's able to bring some normalcy, some dedication to democracy and the Constitution that speaks to moderate voters, while also elevating the issues that work for all Americans that are some of those progressive issues, such as like lowering costs for people, health care, when it comes to voting rights and democracy and abortion care, all of these things. And so the Biden campaign has to thread that needle really carefully in a way that speaks to the largest group of a coalition that does include some of those moderate and swing voters that supported Nikki Haley.
Matthew, NBC's Chuck Todd points out that both candidates are in a stronger position than they had previously been going into this debate. You have Biden's recent bump in the polls, Trump's strong fundraising haul last month. Who has more to lose tomorrow night?
Well, I don't know who has more to lose, but I'll say who has more to gain, I think, and who has the best opportunity to gain in this. And to me, the best opportunity to gain is Joe Biden in this, because there's been questions throughout the last 6 months, 7 months, especially raised by Donald Trump and the Republicans, that Joe Biden just doesn't have the capacity, a mental stamina, whatever it happens to be. And if Joe Biden crosses just the bar that the Republicans have already set, then I think he has the most to gain. I don't see this much movement surrounding Donald Trump. Opinions of Donald Trump are pretty locked in, both positively and negatively in this. And so the movement, I think, that could occur to Biden's benefit in the aftermath. But again, there's so few voters out there right now. About 92% of the public is basically decided this race. And so there's about 7 or 8% that are left to sort of could swing back and forth in this. And any movement of just 2 or 3 points is significant. And so to me, it's not so much who could lose. I think the one that has the most to gain because of the expectations bar is Joe Biden.
Alencia, there's policy, there's the personality. Two things we'll be watching closely in terms of how this debate unfolds. James Carville, a widely known political consultant who worked alongside President Bill Clinton, had this to say about the debate, quote, "I don't have any doubt that Biden's going to walk in there with a good deal of ammunition. Can he shoot straight? It's one thing to have ammunition. It's another thing to hit the expletive target." What does Biden hit Trump on tomorrow? What is that target?
Listen, he has to not only just hit him on the convictions and what he did that led to January 6th, he has to hit him on his record, right? President Biden is out here ensuring, particularly as we think about this week, that abortion rights not only is reestablished in this country, advances. He has to make sure Donald Trump answers the question about what he would do. He has to hit Donald Trump on him cozying up to corporations when middle-class America is struggling. There are so many policy pieces that President Biden can hit former President Trump on, and we will hopefully see that tomorrow in the debate. And one thing that I want to be clear on is that while, yes, roughly 90% of folks have already decided who they're going to vote for, I think where President Biden has to make up some steam is around the enthusiasm, right? There are a lot of people who aren't excited about this race, and tomorrow is the first opportunity I think a lot of folks will have to gain some excitement that will also help pull some of the voters that are needed for President Biden to win in these key swing states.
We know President Biden's been at Camp David doing some thorough preparations, mock debates, and studying the issues. Here's what former President Trump had to say about his mindset and his approach to tomorrow night's event.
I think I've been preparing for it for my whole life, if you want to know the truth. And I'm not sure you can lock yourself into a room for 2 weeks or 1 week or 2 days and really learn what you have to know. And I've been through it.
Matthew, your reaction to that?
That sounds a lot like candidates that go in and lose debates. I mean, I remember I was involved with George W. Bush in 2004, incumbent president, very close race in this. And he basically took it for granted, shrugged his shoulders. I've been president. I know more. And he ended up losing that first debate. And the race went from a 4 or 5 point Bush advantage to even in about a week in the course of this. And so anytime a candidate says that, first of all, it's a sign of complete, utter arrogance in this. That's like, I prepared my whole life to go into a debate when the future of democracy is at hand. The idea that he thinks that is crazy. But any candidate that talks like that is not going to do well heading into it, depending, again, as we've all talked about, on what Joe Biden does and how he reacts. But Donald Trump's preparation doesn't set himself up well for success.
Matthew Dowd and Alencia Johnson, I appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.